Hi there. Welcome to today's episode of Stand Up, where I welcome the great Tim Wise for another amazing conversation. Tim will join us, by the way, in Las Vegas at PODJAM. He'll be one of our special guests where we will tape an episode in front of him, do a Q&A. Hope to see you there. Get tickets for PODJAM in the show notes right now and join us March 28th to 30th in Las Vegas. Happy New Year's Eve, everybody. Thank you very much for pressing play on today's podcast all of this week. It's just the guest doing guest interviews. The regular format will be abandoned for this week as I try to restructure, re-energize, rejuvenate, and get ready for 2025 myself. Thank you very much to everybody who joined the Hangout last night. We had a great Monday Hangout where we had over 50 listener subscribers there and an awesome conversation for about 2 hours. If you missed it, you can relive it at the link included to all paid subscribers. And if you're not a paid subscriber, sign up now, patreon.com/PeteDominic. I cannot do any of this without you. So please join us in 2025. Be a part of our community. We're really excited to have you. If you haven't already, become a paid subscriber. Join and get all of the benefits of this wonderful community. I hope to see you on the Discord platform at the next Hangout or in person at some point, because the other big news is I got a map of the United States of America. I put it on my wall, and I want to put a pin in it where you live. So send me an email, standupwithpete@gmail.com, and say, this is where I live, and include anything you want or just the town that you live in. If you don't want to include the exact address, that's fine, but just tell me a little bit about the town where you live, if you like it, because I'm planning to travel across the country in 2026 at some point when my daughter graduates high school, and I want to come see you. So send me that email now. Where do you live? standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, let's get to my conversation with Tim Wise. Before I do, I briefly want to just mention the news. Like I said, I've abandoned the regular format, the good stuff, the news, the clips for this week. But I will tell you, yesterday in one sentence from WTF just happened today, a federal appeals court upheld the $5 million verdict against Trump in the sexual abuse and defamation case brought by Jon Carroll. Trump endorsed Mike Johnson for another term. Trump sided with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy on H-1B visas over his MAGA acolytes who want to stop immigration and preserve jobs for American workers. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned that extraordinary measures will be necessary as early as January 14th to prevent the U.S. from defaulting on its debt. The Treasury Department was hacked by a Chinese state-sponsored actor using third-party software to access the government workstations and unclassified documents. Trump urged the Supreme Court to block a law that requires TikTok to be sold or shut down by January 19th. Biden announced nearly $2.5 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. Biden privately regrets dropping out of the presidential race and reportedly believes he could have defeated Trump if it wasn't for his June debate performance and low poll numbers that led to his own party pressuring him to drop out. 46% of Republicans support using the military. What? To put undocumented immigrants into internment camps until they can be deported. 46% of Republicans answered that poll. Wow. And about 7 in 10 Democrats said that they're stepping back from political news since the election. That's just most or some or a lot, or depending on how you put it, what happened yesterday in one sentence. All right. Now, time to get to my conversation with Tim Wise. Tim, of course, is a highly respected writer and speaker. He spent his whole life as an activist. You can follow him on Instagram at TimWiseOfficial. You can follow him on Blue Sky as well as Medium, where he's written a couple of essays recently. Get one of his 10 books and learn more about Tim in today's show notes. All right, let's do it with one of the best, Tim Wise. Yes, Tim Wise, one more time before the year ends, one of our favorite people to talk to, and so much to talk with you about. But before we get into it all, you personally have any traditions or feelings about this time of year? I call it Taint Week between Christmas and New Year's. Do you have resolutions? How do you feel about this time of year where nothing gets done? I was so happy you agreed to even talk to me because people turn it all off.
I have been turned off entirely and turned out a little bit, tuned out of everything for the last week. So it was actually great to be able to talk with you because I do at this time of the year, my only tradition is to basically phone it in for the last 2 weeks. Like I just give up. I don't really work hard on anything. I limp to the finish line. And although oddly enough, I say that, and yet in the last week or so since I decided to phone it in, I actually wrote 2 essays. I haven't written anything.
I was going to say, I was going to immediately bring that up. There's 2 new pieces at your Medium, which I want to talk with you about. So that was awesome, but okay.
It was weird. Like I actually got back in the swing of doing that, which was nice. I think maybe that was because I was taking time off from my regular work and I just had time to sit and do it. But yeah, this is that time of year where I'm just like, you know what? Let's just get it done. This year has been shit in a lot of different ways nationally and globally. So let's just get to the new year and we'll figure it out then. I think I'm probably like a lot of people. I'm sure productivity drops off the map for most people.
Yeah. No, you have full permission to do nothing, especially not return any email or sit in front of your computer doing that type of a thing. So I love it. But, by the way, just real quick, well, do you have any goals career wise that you could share with us next year? Because you write these 2 most recent pieces I'm going to talk with you about. Yeah. And my feeling about you, and I know everybody listening feels the same way about you, is you're prolific. Like it makes me almost, I said this to you before on and off the record, annoyed that you don't put out more. Like what prevents you from writing something really great every day? Because I feel like you could turn it on and turn it off without hardly any editing at all. And it being an original, passionate, thoughtful, informative, interesting piece. So what's the deal?
Well, part of it is I'm a classic procrastinator. I've got about 25 essays started right now that I just haven't finished. And now I've had conversations with my therapist about what that is. I was guessing depression, but I don't really feel that depressed. And so he was like, well, anxiety disorder masks as depression. And I definitely have first-rate anxiety disorder. So I think that's probably what it is. So my goal for 2025 is to deal better with my anxiety disorder. And I'm very anxious about the prospects of that, to tell you the truth. Probably other than that, I do want to be more productive. I work with African American Policy Forum, Kim Crenshaw and the folks at AAPF, and we're looking forward to a really big year trying to just defend our frameworks of critical race theory and intersectionality from this full-scale assault that they are under both at the college and university level, but also in corporate America and government agencies where all of these sort of trainings and any discussion of race is being attacked. So we're gearing up to be on the front of that battle because I'll tell you, one of the things that's disturbing us in the wake of the election as an organization and me as an individual is how many people seem really intimidated about the prospects of the backlash that we know is coming. It's not even speculative. We know it's going to happen. And there are a lot of people, I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to say who, but there are people within the larger orbit of the anti-racism, racial justice community, civil rights community who seem to be a little bit gun shy, so to speak, and worried about saying too much. And are they going to get in trouble? And is the administration going to come after them? We assume that they're going to come after all of us. And that's why we have to stay strong. They thrive on intimidation. What the right is really about, obviously, is trying to get people to self-censor. They know, for example, that these laws that they've passed against DEI and critical race theory and teaching about race in school, they know that they are unconstitutional. In fact, so far, every single one of those laws that's gone to court has been struck down or put on hold as a result of judges, often Republicans, saying that they're unconstitutional. They know that these are not legal laws, but they hope that teachers will capitulate ahead of time, that colleges will capitulate ahead of time, that companies will capitulate and end their DEI programs ahead of time, that government agencies will. And so for those of us in the civil rights and racial justice community, we've got to stand strong. So my goal is to obviously to be a part of that and also to be more productive in terms of my individual content. I'm planning on writing a whole lot more. I've done probably about 10 or 15 little short videos, none of which I've released yet, but I'm going to start doing that after the first of the year also.
Yeah. Where will you, that's another thing that's so easy for you to do. Where will you be posting videos?
Well, I'll post them on Instagram. I'd like to post them on TikTok if it doesn't go away.
I heard you were joining TikTok the day it was canceled. That's how much of a Luddite you are.
Yeah, exactly right. As soon as it's canceled, I'll be on board because then it'll be radical enough for me then.
Look for Tim Wise's TikTok launching January 9th. Oh, whoops.
You'll be able to see it in Malaysia. You won't be able to see it here. But no, if TikTok remains, I will probably get on there just for the simple reason that literally every 3 or 4 days, I get a message from someone. Usually it's an Instagram DM that says, "Oh, I found this video of you on TikTok," and then they go viral. They go semi-viral. And it's me giving a talk, I don't know, 10 years ago, 6 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever. And I can usually tell by how gray my beard is and how much hair I have and don't have. And it's like, wow, I guess if my stuff is, and it's always somebody saying like, who is this man? Like, well, shit, maybe I should tell you and have my own TikTok and take away the mystery. I don't know.
Yeah, because I plan to benefit and continue to profit from, as I have, your wisdom all of next year in all of the formats. I'm going to be a YouTube star this next year. I don't think I told you that.
I hope you will be. And then I would love to learn how to do that too, because I really do think that YouTube is the platform that when all of a lot of these sort of go by the wayside, I think it does have the most staying power in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons.
Yep. For sure. And
so I'm with you on that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get to some of the things you have been writing. Actually, let's talk first, though, not about one of your recent pieces that you wrote the last couple of weeks, but something you published back in September 2019, which is really relevant now when we get to talking about the HB1 visas because of the huge emphasis that America and every other country, every other leading country, China, specifically India, have put on emphasis. You suggest that we need a different acronym, MESH. Where do you want to start on this this controversy about HB1 visas, the MAGA civil war between Vivek and Elon versus Steve Bannon and Laura Loomer or whoever else? I'm not sure exactly who's on what side.
Yeah, so let me just clarify. So the 2019 piece you're talking about is the one where I critique the sort of obsession with STEM education. And that's not because I don't believe in STEM, and it's not because I was shitty at all the STEM subjects. And I'm not bitter, although I was shitty at them and I am bitter. But the reason I wrote the piece the way that I did almost 5 years ago now, almost 6 years, is that I felt at the time, and I still feel, that we as a society have been moving in this direction in the last several years, and we're seeing this now play out in the discussion about H-1B, but this society that wants to put all the emphasis on STEM subjects. And this is not just people on the right. This is progressives as well. Even the sort of push for like black girls who code or whatever, all of which is great. Like, I think we need to get more folks who have been marginalized and locked out of STEM into STEM. But the problem is still that emphasis is still this idea that all we need is computer people, computer programmers, IT professionals, and engineers, and that we don't need anyone else. We don't need artists. We don't need poets. We don't need historians. We don't need people that are aware of sort of ethical dilemmas. And so what I was talking about in my piece was the need to add to STEM, not to replace it or get rid of it, but to add to it what I call mesh education, M for media literacy, because God knows we need that on a lot of different levels in our society, not just discerning truth from fiction in political messaging, but also the manipulation of consumers by corporations trying to sell us stuff and the way that social media manipulates us. So M is for media literacy. E is for ethics, right? We have so many ethical dilemmas that we live with every single day. Could be, how do we balance out the threat to the environment and the need for economic development? What's the ethical dilemma there? How do we resolve it? You can think of many others that don't always break down on a neat right-left axis, but that are important to us as a society. But if you don't take philosophy in college or you're not a theologian, you probably don't even engage E for ethics. So that's the E. S is sociology, because sociology is really the only discipline that one can learn where you come to understand the dynamics between groups in a society and the power relationships between those groups, which give you the ability to have a sociological imagination and thereby to interpret the world that exists. It's easy to see the world as it exists. And you can say, well, I see there's this massive inequality, for instance, between the rich and the poor. But sociology is a discipline that allows you to figure out, how did that happen? Right. Why did that happen? Right. What were the forces behind it? And then the H is for history. We know that our history education is for shit in this country. It might be elsewhere as well, but certainly here it is. For those of us that are old enough, I don't know if this is still the case. I hope it's not. But for many generations, Americans, children were growing up learning that ridiculous story about George Washington and the cherry tree, which wasn't a true story. It didn't happen. George Washington didn't actually go to his father and go, Daddy, I cut down the cherry tree and I cannot tell a lie. Apparently, he could tell a lie because he made the story up, or the historians did many generations later. But we learned that as opposed to the fact that George Washington was a particularly vicious enslaver who used to take out bounties on his runaways and have them brought back to him. And he would say things in the advertisements like, don't whip them more than 200 times. That's excessive. But up to 200 is fine if you need to subdue them and bring them back to me. So I'm just saying we need a better understanding of history. We need a better understanding of sociology, ethics, and media literacy. And in fact, if we had better mesh education, the STEM education that we do. Yes, that's because the thing that science fetishists and engineer people that love STEM think STEM is objective, STEM is factual, and all this other stuff is soft science, or it's not even science at all. It's the humanities. Who cares about that? But the reality is that science isn't objective. Science has been used to marginalize, oppress, and murder people. The Nazis used science to do everything that they did. The eugenicist in this country that helped sterilize over 100,000 women in the 20th century, disproportionately women of color, used science to justify that. Adolf Hitler based his race policies on the scientifically derived policies that we were using in this country at the time and gave us credit for all of his thinking. So science has been misused over and over again. If we understood history, we would actually be better at doing science and noticing what is junk science versus what is legitimate science. So I was just trying to make that argument. And in light of the H-1B controversy, it's particularly relevant because here you have a group of people, the Viveks of the world, the Elons of the world, who literally fetishize tech. They think tech is the answer to everything. There's no problem that tech can't solve. We're going to colonize Mars because of tech. We're going to use AI to save the world, although we also admit AI might destroy the world. But because we created it and it might destroy the world, now we have to harness it to save the world. But they don't even realize the contradiction, which is that their tech fetish is now threatening the world. And now they've got to use more tech to fix the problem that they created. But their fetishizing of this technology-based, science-based, everything is math and everything is based on your ability to code and understand these things. That fetishizing is part of why they will critique American culture as Vivek did, right? Saying we're just a bunch of lazy, basically saying about American culture what all of the right was saying about black people for years. And they didn't mind it when they were just saying it about black people. And now Vivek and Elon are saying it about white Americans. And they're like, what are you saying? We're not lazy. What are you talking about? But this is what these people think because they honestly have this very narrow notion of merit. They have a very narrow notion of intelligence. They think that intelligence is something that you can take a quote unquote IQ test and you're either a genius or you're not. Right. These are people who actually believe in a cognitive elite of people. And in Elon's case, he's essentially all but said that he thinks that society should be run by those people. And people like himself. And I think that this is a good time for us to revisit the notion of mesh education as a balance to that, because otherwise what we're going to end up with is a society that has a lot of people that can program your computer, but people who don't know how to maintain a multiracial democracy. Yes. All really so important. So important. Go read that piece because you make a lot more points that you didn't just even make and add to it. It's such a valid argument for so many reasons. And obviously, mesh would, if we had more of that in this country, you could see how it benefits the Finnish or a lot of other countries who do focus a lot more on many of those other subjects. But we want to turn people out that are going to make the most money for capitalism, for a capitalist society. That more than anything, I would imagine, is why curriculum is structured the way it is, more STEM and less mesh, probably, right? Of course. Look, that's the reality. The tech bros and the people, the sort of the masters of the universe in the corporate world don't really care whether or not how to think. In fact, they probably prefer you didn't think.
Right, because then you might unionize.
Right. Critical thinking. Yeah, you might unionize. You might argue, oh, these benefits suck. We should probably fight for better benefits, or you would fight for a safer workplace. You might not accept Elon Musk saying that he doesn't want yellow danger lines in his car manufacturing facilities because he personally doesn't like the color yellow or orange or whatever it is, some color he doesn't like, which is normally used to denote danger in a manufacturing plant. And he just doesn't like it. So it's like, even though that's a safety thing, it's like, but I don't like yellow or I don't like orange. And my neuroatypicality takes precedence over your safety, right? That's the nice way of saying it. Right. But that's the thing, like guys like that don't understand. And here's the point. If people like Elon, not even him, because he is who he is, but a lot of the people that hang on his every word, who buy into this idea that there's a meritocracy. He's been saying a lot about that as he's been going off on the woke mind virus and as he's been going off on DEI and critiquing DEI. He turns it into this debate, as many on the right do, that DEI violates the notion of meritocracy, which has always been central to the experiment of America. But if you understood history, you would actually know, and sociology, you would actually know that we've never been a meritocracy. It's hilarious to me to hear people like Vivek and Elon talk about how we've become, Elon called it a mediocrity recently. You think we're a mediocrity really compared to 100 years ago when when white male Protestant rich guys from the East Coast could go to Harvard, not even go to class, and get a gentleman's C? You think George W. Bush was a deeper thinker than anybody at Harvard, at Yale right now? And the least qualified first-year student at Yale right now, I guarantee you, is incredibly more qualified than George W. Bush or any of his classmates were when they were at Yale, let alone people 50 years before that or 100 years before that, where there were no admission standards. 150 years ago, you could get a law license without passing the bar. You didn't have to go to law school. You didn't have to do any of that. You just had to be connected to the right people. So this idea that we become a mediocre society because, as Vivek put it, I guess people were watching Saved by the Bell and they liked Slater and whatever Mark Paul Gosselaar's character, Zach, better than Screech. Like, that's the downfall of Western civilization.
That's perfect.
That presupposes that America was this meritocratic place where the cream always rose to the top. And if you understood history, you'd know that's bullshit. Right. That's why we need mesh education, not because it's going to change Elon's mind. He is who he is. Vivek, he is who he is. But your average person who listens to that and goes, yeah, man, like they're studying irrelevant subjects now, not like back in the old days when they didn't do shit. Well, they didn't show up. They didn't have to show up.
The point has been made first by historians and the rest of us that are listening to them over and over, but it really bears need to be belabored that if we understood history, we would be less likely to so easily give up on democracy, but we don't. We've never struggled that way, the way other nations have and the way previous Americans did. And those living in certain states, certainly even under Jim Crow, I suppose you could throw them in. But this is why you need history more than ever before. And obviously you're seeing them try to erase the history that they don't like, that they don't feel good about.
Sure, because if you can make history education, not just secondary, but tertiary, or just essentially marginalize it altogether so that you either don't tell the truth or even you don't even tell the lie. You just don't even focus on it. It's like civics. Who cares about that? That's not, you're not going to get a job. You're not going to have a job of the future. We're not going to go to Mars because you studied art. We're not going to go, who cares about any of that? You should all be programmers. You should all be working in IT. And in Elon's mind, everybody should be working 80 hours a week in what he calls hardcore culture. Now, how in the world this dude wants us to believe that he works 80 hours a week when he apparently spends multiple hours a week gaming on gaming platforms, sends out tweets at least 12 hours a day, and does ketamine for the rest of the week? I don't know how he expects us to believe that he's a hardcore employee who works that hard, but he wants his people to. He wants his people to be the equivalent of robots and doesn't understand the harm that does. We've got to have history education so we understand that what he's doing is the same thing that the early industrialists wanted people on assembly lines to do, that wanted people in coal mines to do, that wanted people in steel plants to do, didn't want them to have any kind of significant labor protections, didn't want them to have safety protections, doing the same kind of thing. He is no different than this country's historic oligarchs or this country's historic economic elites who have always wanted to wring the last drop of sweat and labor out of hardworking people and call that a meritocracy and call that a workable system. If we had better history education, we would have better defenses against that because we would see the patterns. We would understand, Elon Musk is no different than the robber barons of the early 1900s, that he's no different than the exploiters who laid all the lines of railway and used Chinese labor and didn't care if they died. No different than the plantation owners who worked enslaved people to death. It's no different. But if you don't have a history education that allows you to see those themes recurring because we don't want to learn that in school or we want to act like things are always getting better. So, yeah, we had the exploitation of child labor and all that back in the day, but now we're past that. That's the way we teach history. If you teach history that way or don't teach it at all, you can't be surprised when people don't notice the kind of thing that Elon is about, or that Vivek is about, or for that matter, what Donald Trump is about. Donald Trump's not original either. Donald Trump is playing a tune that has been played over and over again in American history. George Wallace played this tune. Father Coughlin, the radio host, played this tune back in the 1930s. Have always been people who have been prepared to exploit the fears. The Know Nothing Party in the middle of the 19th century did this. All the anti-immigrant folks in the early 1900s that were part of the Dillingham Commission that restricted immigration to this country. All of those folks played the very same tune that Donald Trump is playing. But if you don't know history, you might think to yourself, well, I'm sure this won't get bad, right? Like, we're America, we'll be okay. But if you actually look at history, you'll notice when these things have happened before, some really horrible stuff has happened to people in this country and around the world. And that's why I think they don't want us to know history, because if we understood it, then we would have better defenses against what they are doing in the past.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Whether they know that or not. What else do you want to say about this kind of MAGA civil war over this issue, much less any other? Elon Musk says he will fight to the death or some shit like that on this issue. He says, go fuck yourself in the face, he tweeted, I think that's exactly what he said.
That's exactly what the wealthiest man on the planet, you want to hear him say, fuck yourself in the face. It's very mature. It's very grown up. He's an emotional 11-year-old.
Yeah, it's extremely.
He jumps up and down like a Teletubby on a stage. It's frightening to believe that the wealthiest man and one of the most powerful men or people on the planet is an emotional 11-year-old.
You know, that's dangerous for so many obvious reasons and some that aren't. But the other thing that you and I, who are both very funny people, I'll say, notice about Elon Musk is that he really is humorless. He does try to make jokes and he thinks certain things that aren't funny other than two 11-year-olds are funny. But I feel like the fact that he's humorless actually matters and contributes.
Oh, it does. His sense of humor is making 69 jokes on X. That's his sense of humor, is like, how many times can I use the numbers 69 or 420? Yeah. Like, and then people will go, oh, he smokes weed and likes two-way oral.
Well, those things which are both things to like, but those are things
and Elon would never have had either if he weren't rich.
Well, that's also true. But the other thing is that those are jokes that we all made around 11 or 12. Boys did. Right, as soon as you found out what 69 was, it was amazing. Right. And then at some point around 16 or older, you're like, I'm not going to make that joke anymore because it's so hacky.
It's so cringy. Right. And because he's socially awkward, doesn't get the actual
Why is it so bad to be humorless if you're him with the platform that he commands?
Because I think if people with power are dangerous more if they are not, first of all, have self-awareness and the ability to be self-deprecating. I don't think anyone ought to have $400 billion personally. I don't think there's any reason for anyone to be that wealthy, but I don't begrudge people money, even a lot of it, and power if they are wielding it in a humble way and in a way that shows self-deprecation. I can appreciate a rich person who makes themselves the butt of the joke, for instance. I can appreciate a Republican who's willing to make themselves the butt of the joke. I will appreciate anybody who's willing to turn the camera around and say, you know what, sometimes I say stupid shit. And Elon won't do that. Donald Trump won't do that. That's the problem with these folks. And I think it's got to do, of course, with their wealth, or in Trump's case, his sort of exaggerated wealth, but his persona of wealth is there's no humor behind it. You can never make yourself the butt of the joke. It's always someone else who has to be the butt of the joke. It's like everything is a roast for these guys. Yeah. And even good comics that are good at roasting still will roast themselves. They will still make remarks in the middle of a roast that are self-directed, or at the very least, when they turn the mic over to the other comic, they expect that other comic to attack them. Right? Like, I just watched this roast on Netflix of 2024 that Jeff Ross did and a bunch of comics on. Yeah. And I don't like all these comics. They're not my comedic cup of tea necessarily, but they all know that they're going to not only give, they're going to get. Oh, yeah. I can appreciate that. I respect that, because even that means if you say a really obnoxious joke. And there were quite a few that were like a little bit over that line, but you know that you're going to get it back. Somebody's going to throw it back at you. And I can appreciate that. These guys can't do that. And so when you're that rich and you're that powerful and you never allow yourself to be the target, even for the sake of going, hey, Goodwin, you got me, then it just says to me that you take yourself far too seriously, that you are incredibly thin-skinned. And I can't think of anything more dangerous than somebody with nuclear weapons at their disposal,
exactly.
$400 billion at their disposal,
exactly.
all of those satellites at his disposal, who has that thin a skin.
It's a sign of your definition of honor in their case, as well as their definition of what it means to be strong or confident, but it's not certainly what my definition of confidence is. And when you are a funny person and you're making jokes only at everybody else's expense, and then when we make one at yours, you don't laugh, I consider you to be the meltiest snowflake of all. It's like, what, you can't laugh at yourself, but you're poking fun at everybody else. You've not evolved. You're not mature. You're not confident. You're insecure and you're small, which is what I think these men are. But what do you make of the fact that now they're at each other and fighting with each other? What do you make of this, quote, MAGA civil war?
I think if it leads to what I hope it does, which is a huge cage match between Bannon and Musk in 2025, it will all have been worth it. That's what I want to see. I want to see Steve Bannon in his sweaty gin and regret jacket that he wears everywhere. Or maybe it's scotch. I think he smells more like scotch.
I worked with him for a long time, and I'll tell you, we shared a studio, and I'll tell you, he doesn't smell like anything. He has no smell, and he does not appear in a mirror when he walks past one.
Right. Well, he might have a scent of sulfur then, I suppose. Might be
maybe that was.
But I want to see that. It's frightening to me when Laura Loomer and Steve Bannon say things and I go, oh, that sort of made sense. Yeah. It scares the shit out of me. Because in this particular case, even though I think Loomer and Bannon are far too extreme in their overall hatred of H-1B, which I think has a purpose, although it is horribly abused. But I certainly prefer their critique of it, which at least gets us to really look at this thing and recognize what companies like Tesla are doing. There's a new report, just out that I read today about Tesla. Tesla laid off like 10 to 14% of its workforce last year, and yet they are bringing in people on H-1B to essentially take those jobs. They were laying off senior engineers, replacing them with junior engineers, mostly brought in from South Asia, to save themselves money. So I like the fact that critique is being raised because that is an issue. And it's not, and it's important, however, this is the difference, For Laura Loomer, her critique is it's these awful, stinky, low IQ Indians because she's a racist, So her argument is it's lowering the quality of America by letting these brown people in. Bannon doesn't quite go there. Bannon actually tries to almost make it like an anti-racist argument, like we need to get more black folks from America in STEM and we need to do this and they're taking those jobs. So he doesn't quite go to the vicious white nationalist place that Loomer does, but he's still, I would say, exaggerating the case as if somehow the program should be entirely junked. And yet I find myself listening to them going, other than the ridiculously racist elements of Loomer's critique and the fact that Steve Bannon apparently said Elon's going to owe reparations now for all the American jobs that have been lost, which seems a little bit jumping the gun. I do want to suggest that they are more on the right side of this issue than Vivek and Elon are, because Vivek and Elon are basically, as I said, they're taking this critique that the right has always had of black culture and black communities. They don't value education enough. They just care about sports and entertainment. They don't work hard. They don't study hard, all of which is racist bullshit. And Vivek and Elon are going, yeah, but we weren't just talking about black folks. We actually meant all of y'all are losers and we're the only ones who know what's best for America. This coming from, in the case of Elon, somebody who has never been able to have a successful business that was not subsidized by the government, and Vivek, who became wealthy taking a drug that had failed 4 clinical trials, buying it, rebranding it, doing an IPO, and cashing out before it failed the next clinical trial. He's a criminal who ought to be in prison, and he's going to tell us about our culture being inferior. It's hilarious to watch these people apply the cultural racism of the last 30 years to America as a whole and basically say, all y'all suck. And I think this might be one of those areas where people on the left and some of these people on the right, for the wrong reasons, sadly, can find some common cause for essentially repudiating this notion of cultural supremacy, this notion of other people's cultures are superior, or that we should be able to rank them in some kind of order. This isn't about culture. This isn't about, as Elon said, finding the top 0.1% of talent. A disproportionate share of the people coming in on H-1Bs are back-end IT specialists. They're computer systems analysts. They're not even programmers. They're not engineers. They're doing back-end IT. That is not something that you need to go to Bangalore to find somebody to do.
Right.
Like, you could find someone to do that. You could train them to do that, but you'd have to pay them a higher wage.
Yeah, one of the issues is my understanding is you hear a lot of people say that I'm training the guy replacing me.
And that's exactly what is happening in many cases. And listen, it's not just happening with H-1B. We know that there are a lot of folks I've spoken to over the years, older employees who've worked at a company for a long time, who are then training their younger replacements. They might all be Americans. They could all be native-born Americans. But they're doing it because the company knows that if they keep that older person on, they're going to have to pay maybe expensive healthcare benefits. It's a lot cheaper to bring in the younger person or to bring in the temp worker, right? So this is a problem. This is a crisis of American capitalism in general, right? This idea that we're trying to squeeze out every single nickel. And whether that's the health insurance industry by denying legitimate claims, which obviously is in the news right now for obvious reasons that we all understand, or whether that's the tech industry trying to do the same thing, it's time that we all call bullshit on that notion that the most important thing is making profit for corporate overlords, right? That is something that people on the left and some of the people who have attached themselves to MAGA might be able to agree upon. I don't think we're going to agree on much else, but if we can find some common ground on this and push back on the oligarchic views of somebody like Elon and the views of someone like Vivek, all the better. So we'll see what happens. I think at the end of the day, it's still important that we reject the overtly racist reasons why so many on Twitter are going after South Asian programmers and people on H-1B. Right. That's unacceptable. We can't make common cause with people who make it about the ethnicity, the nationality. It isn't about that. These people could be from anywhere, but if they're being brought in and exploited, because let's be clear, some of those workers are being exploited. If I come in on an H-1B, it is incredibly difficult for me to quit my job and not get kicked out of the country. There's a process that you can undergo where you could leave your existing employer. And I think you've got like 60 days to find a new gig. That's not always so easy to do, right? So essentially, if I come in on an H-1B, I'm not going to say it's indentured servitude. That's a slap in the face to actual indentured servants from many generations ago. But it's certainly exploited labor. It is certainly exploiting that labor, knowing they have nowhere to go. So if you want to work them 80 hours a week, you want to work them 60 hours a week, so be it. You want to have horrible working conditions with supervisors that are assholes, too bad. Where are they going to go, right? And that is something we ought not accept for any worker, whether that's a native-born worker or someone who's been brought in. Nobody should be subjected to that kind of abuse. And that's something that I think hopefully we can all agree on.
Yeah, well, I don't know if we can all agree on it, but I certainly would hope to. But luckily, they can't govern. Does that bring you any comfort?
Yeah, they're a mess. And I think as long as the Democrats will stay out of their way and let them fuck up, then things will be fine. My concern is that you've got Democrats are older Democrats. I'm not going to say this is true for everybody, but the older guard of the party are such institutionalists, right? And they believe in the institution for the sake of the institution. And so they're the kind of people that will say things like, we need to work together to solve problems, and then Americans will reward us at the ballot box. Wake up. Americans are not voting for people to get shit done. They're voting for people who speak up for what they consider their tribe. If Democrats want to be elected, they have to speak up, and they have to speak with the same level of anger and rage about the system as people on the right. You can't, and I said this the other day on Blue Sky, and I think I posted it on X as well. But one of the things that I realized after the election is if you've got an election where one candidate is prepared to channel rage and anger, and the other candidate is leaning into joy and excitement, as much as I prefer joy and excitement, and I found that exhilarating in Vice President Harris's campaign, I thought it was wonderful. But what makes an angry person angriest of all, right? It's the person who's happy. Because how can you be happy when I'm miserable? How can you be happy when I'm angry? And so if you lean into joy or you lean into competence, look at all my great plans that I've got to make your life better. You are expressing a kind of confidence and a kind of excitement and exuberance that makes the miserable person double down on their misery. So we cannot match rage and anger with joy and excitement as much as we'd like to. And I don't mean this to be a critique of Vice President Harris. She's not a candidate of rage and anger. It just doesn't suit her. Yeah. But moving forward, I don't think Democrats are going to be able to run people whose big argument is, I'll get things done better, or I'm more competent. That's the Michael Dukakis strategy for becoming president of the United States. And we saw what happened there. So you have to have a candidate that is willing to acknowledge that the system is broken, that the system is flawed, and that you're part of why it's flawed, that your party's participated in that too. Because Donald Trump had no problem saying the system is broken, and it's been broken by both parties. And you know what? And that party has been the one that's been rewarded for that. And if Democrats want to stand on the side and act like, well, we're just going to help get things done for the sake of getting things done, we're not going to be rewarded. The left won't be rewarded. Liberals won't be rewarded. Democrats won't be rewarded. The party that has the presidency will be rewarded for anything that gets done. By the same token, if they own every failure because the Democrats refuse to cooperate and participate, it will be hung on them. They will be to blame for it. So my big fear is that Democrats will just say, well, let's work together on these things, like Bernie Sanders saying, well, Doge, they're going to cut the military budget. No, they're not. They're not going to cut the military budget. But I know it. Stop participating in this foolishness. Let them own their failures. And I just feel like they're willing to do that to us. They're willing to not pass any legislation, basically, right, for a year at a time. And we don't care. We'll have a whole Congress where we don't get anything done, where we pass silly resolutions and we do investigations of shit that isn't illegal, right? And then we come along and we're like, but we really need to govern. People want us to govern. People want us to find common ground. No, nobody really is begging for that. But if that's what they think, then that's what they're going to do, and that's going to backfire.
Yeah, and we've seen that Congress before. The issue is if they can't come to an agreement to keep the government open. But you had this great thread, I think you were referring to it there, on Blue Sky, where you've been killing it, where you write, Republicans do politics by identifying a problem, then the villain they blame for it. Democrats do politics by identifying a problem, then suggest there are no villains because we all basically want the same thing. We just have different ways to get there. So let's work together. And you wrote a thread on why it fails. But you started by saying MAGA is offering a compelling moral narrative. Yes, they are. But the point you make next is the most important. Even if it's based on a foundation of bullshit, it's still compelling. It's still convincing. It's still winning. It's still giving people somebody or something to blame things on. So you can take it from there. But
yeah, if you had two people trying to sell you a script for a movie, and one of them had a narrative arc that identified a bad guy and said the whole point of this movie is the struggle against the bad guy. And maybe you don't even know, the ending isn't even written yet. We don't even know if you're going to beat the bad guy, but we've identified the bad guy. We know who the villain is. And the whole movie is going to be about the struggle against the villain. And the other pitch in the elevator is, I got this really compelling story. It's about people that get together and they do really great things and everybody's happy at the end. Woo! Like, which of those movies are you going to watch? Like, there's a reason that that narrative storytelling is almost always has an arc that's similar. You have conflict, you have resolution, and the conflict has to be about identifying who the adversary is. And the right has always done this. The right did this with global communism during the McCarthy era.
Right.
Now, a lot of that was based on bullshit, right? But it was a compelling narrative and it built the modern right wing. Then later on, it became the enemy was the civil rights establishment, the equal rights amendment, secular humanism. You just go down the list, right, of godless, taking God out of the classroom. They always had an enemy. And all of my life, I've noticed the Democrats don't really ever want to name an enemy. They never want to name the adversary unless it's the candidate themselves. So, for instance, in this election, the Democrats said, well, Donald Trump is the enemy. Like, he's the bad guy. He's the fascist. He's the one that's the authoritarian. But the problem is, if the only enemy that you're willing to identify is the literal person you're running against, you're going to have a hard time, because if that person already has the support of millions of people, and we're a very divided country, as we know, then what you're basically saying is this person is the horrible person. Well, if I'm already leaning toward that person, or if I'm even considering voting for that person, if I've ever given any consideration at all to voting for them, now you're asking me to believe that I'm willing to support a monster. Well, most people aren't going to do that.
Right.
So if the only enemy that I'm identifying is that guy, I'm placing an awful lot of faith in people to be willing to go, holy shit, I was going to vote for this absolutely terrible human being. Let me not do that. As opposed to saying, no, the enemy is the right wing. The enemy is conservatism. You won't hear anybody say that. They'll say liberalism is the enemy. They'll say California and New York City are the enemy, but I've never heard anyone go, you know what it is? It's rural Oklahoma, those assholes.
Right.
So it's West Virginia.
Well,
and I'm not saying they should. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that we ought to say it's rural people. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, isn't it interesting how the right has no problem identifying who the bad guys are and building an entire politic which wins around that. And we're sitting there going, well, the problem is this individual, or maybe it's Project 2025 as an entity from the Heritage Foundation, but it's more than that. It's an entire worldview. It's an entire worldview that we have allowed to never be critiqued. Liberalism can be slammed. Conservatism can't be. The left can be slammed. The right cannot be. It's fascinating to me that we don't call things out much more directly, because if we did, we would at least have some type of moral narrative. We would have a compelling moral story. Yeah. Not everybody's going to agree with it, but at least it would be there.
Some of us do. I have for a while, but it's not necessarily as effective or compelling maybe to the progressive mind or the non-political mind as the right wing arguments are. And I would also argue that it's not so much conservatism as it used to be, but it's this anti-democratic MAGA movement, because conservatism at least respected the ideas of democracy, like whoever wins the election wins. And that's that. We're reminded about that, I think, all the time. But this version of right-wing autocracy, worship of the authoritarian MAGA cultism, is something very different. And the constituencies that buy the compelling narratives, we think differently. Our brains think differently, and we're motivated by different things, different causes, including I care about strangers.
Right. We don't want the same thing. This idea that we all want the same thing and just have different ways of getting it, it's just not true. Right. I know there are some people, listen, I know that there are people that voted for Donald Trump, especially this time out, some of the new people that he got for the first time, who are reachable people. I realize that. They are not the early adopters. If you're an early adopter, then you're lost.
You're gone.
I'm sorry. That's the cult. If you were with this guy from 2015, 2016 on, then I have a very hard time believing that your motivations are something other than racial resentment and gender resentment. Those to me are the two things which are the yeast of the MAGA bread. It's not the only ingredients. You might have thrown some raisins or some sesame seeds in that bread or whatever the hell you want to put in the bread. But the racism and sexism, racism and misogyny are the yeast in that bread. Now, are there newcomers who have come along that are partaking in that loaf of bread who weren't part of making it, who maybe have a different motivation? Yeah, that could be. For some of those people, it might be about inflation and they just don't understand how inflation works or how it's cured. It might be gas prices because they don't understand global oil markets and they actually think that Donald Trump can bring the price down and that Joe Biden's the reason the price went up. There are people that are just stupid like that. But I think that is a smaller percentage of the people, and certainly not the long-standing support for Donald Trump. So if the Democrats are going to regain power, they have to be prepared to call the MAGA cult what it is. They need to be prepared to take on that slogan itself and to challenge the legitimacy of that slogan directly for what it says to millions of people for whom this country was never great, or certainly never greater than it is now in terms of opportunity and access, right? They've got to be prepared to do that, but they're so afraid to do it. They're so afraid to say it because they just don't want to step on the toes of evangelical white Christians. They don't want to step on the toes of Christian nationalists. They don't want to step on the toes of reactionaries, but they don't mind while their own toes get stepped on by people who condemn liberalism. And then their answer is, we're not liberals. We're not on the left. What are you talking about? We're moderates. We're centrists. We believe it's like they won't even embrace the progressivism that was the impetus for every piece of progress and legislation that we've had in this country. None of that stuff would have happened if it were up to conservatives or even a lot of moderate liberals. Like it was liberal, left, progressive, and even radical people who were responsible for every step forward that's made this country worth living in. And they're afraid to say that. And that's fascinating to me. And if you're not willing to say it, but then you're going to stand up and say, these people are a threat to democracy, you're not creating a compelling narrative because you're not even explaining why are they a threat to democracy? Because they're challenging the only political philosophy that ever gave us anything worth having in this country. Whether it's a 30-hour work week or the 8-hour workday or an end to child labor or women having the right to vote, which many of them openly say they don't believe in anymore, or whether it's the civil rights movement, every single thing that we take for granted was won by people on the left. And if the Democrats aren't prepared to say that, don't be surprised when you get rolled by the right, who's more than willing to take credit for shit they didn't even do. These people will take credit for an infrastructure bill they voted against.
Oh, yeah.
That's how craven they are.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, we won't take credit for the shit that our side did. They'll take credit for the stuff our side did, which they opposed. They'll talk about all the racial progress. They'll usually critique anti-racists by saying, you ignore the progress. No, we're fully aware of the progress, Precious, and we know y'all weren't part of it. That's the point. Had it been up to you, none of that would have happened. Y'all haven't been any part. That's why you keep talking about Lincoln, because that's the last time y'all did some shit, right? Was that guy.
And there is our clip. Okay, thank you. I'll profit from that on social media. So finally, want to ask you about this very controversial piece you wrote, timjwise.medium.com. Go follow him there. It's titled, In Defense of Doxing Nazis. With the new Department of Justice likely to ignore right-wing terror, citizens will have to use every tool to stop fascists, including this one. We're generally uncomfortable with doxing, right? We're generally uncomfortable with punching people we don't like or disagree with or even hate. But in this case, if you're a Nazi, and I'm not sure how we necessarily define, it's okay. You're making the argument in this piece that doxing, outing Nazis, maybe define doxing for people who don't know, is defensible. Go ahead.
Yeah, this was a really hard piece for me to write because not that long ago, in fact, probably a year and a half ago, I wrote a piece in which it was not about this subject, but I broached the subject near the end, and I made the argument that I didn't support it. My thinking has changed on it primarily because with a new Department of Justice coming in, well, first let me back up for those who haven't read the piece. What got me thinking about this was I got a phone call about a week and a half before Christmas from a Department of Justice attorney from the Civil Rights Division, who wanted to set up a call between me and her supervisor and her and an FBI agent. And at first I was like, what's going on? They said, well, we're contacting you as a victim of racist plot, if you will. And I was like, well, what's going on? And I thought I knew, but I wasn't sure. And they weren't saying yet. And I put it together. We finally talked, and I had been targeted, and I knew I'd been targeted because over the 3 years prior to this, I had the FBI at my home, the home where my family and I used to live, twice in that 3-year period. And I'd also received a phone call from the FBI even after we had moved from there, informing me duty to warn visits, basically duty to warn about a threat. They didn't give me a lot of details because they were still in the middle of the investigation. They couldn't tell me much. But they said, we just want to let you know there's an active threat against your life. Just keep your eyes open. Here's our card. Let us know. I was like, oh, great, whatever. And my life has been threatened a lot, but I never had the FBI have to come to my door. That's when it's hardcore. That's when they are really concerned, right? So they called and they said, we just want to talk to you as a victim. And I'm like, well, you mean potential victim, right? They're like, yes, of course. Turns out that the group that was threatening me, the two leaders, that's a group called the Terrorgram Collective. They were organizing white supremacist and fascist neo-Nazis on Telegram, the platform. And therefore, because they're very clever, they called themselves Terrorgram because Nazis are funny like that. And the two leaders of this group, one male, one female, were arrested back in September, and they're going on trial in 2025. And so they were indicted. They're in prison, awaiting trial, in jail, awaiting trial. And I guess the DOJ just wanted to let me know this is where things stand. We'll keep you posted. We don't think we'll need anything else from you, but because you were one of the targets, which is to say, I was one of the people. There were public officials, there were writers and public intellectuals and whatever. And we all had our individual kill card, they called it, which had our face, our name, our address, and a picture of our house. And in my case, it had all of that because we had been doxxed back in 2018 and that stuff was still out there. Now, as it turns out, don't live at that address anymore. So I certainly hope any Nazis who see this don't go to that address because there's a lovely family there that has nothing to do with me whatsoever. But when they called and told me this, it got me thinking. And I said to them after, I said, well, I thank you for letting me know. And I really hope you guys all have jobs here in a couple of months. And they didn't laugh. They didn't find that very funny. And I said, well, I'm just because I knew they were part of investigation team that looks into these groups. The FBI person in particular is part of, and the ones that I talked to were part of a team that looks at domestic extremism. And there's a very good chance, certainly if Kash Patel heads the FBI, that is going to be disbanded or at least deprioritized to the point where they're not going to be infiltrating groups like that. The reason Telegram Collective was stopped before their people could kill anyone, because they were encouraging their followers to kill people and become veritable saints in the pantheon of white supremacist and separatist saints. They were encouraging that. The only reason it didn't happen was because they had been infiltrated. What are the odds that a Kash Patel FBI is going to continue to do that? My guess is they're not very good, which means that if the state is going to take a dive on its obligation to keep track of terrorists just because they're right wingers and white racist and they don't believe that's a problem,
then we have to.
Or if anything, they support them. If the government's not going to keep tabs on them, that means we have to protect ourselves. And part of doing that might very well be letting these people know we're going to continue to infiltrate you. We're going to continue. And I say we, some of the Antifa researchers that are out there, Unicorn Riot and others that expose some of these people, expose their identities. Those people are going to have to they're going to have to get our support because I'd like for the FBI to handle it. I'd love for law enforcement to be on top of it. But the reality is I don't expect that we can expect them to be. And I don't want these people to think that they have free reign. So if they're not going to fear the state, if they're not going to fear indictment, if they're not going to fear the FBI coming and knocking on their door and arresting them for being terrorists, at least let them be afraid that if they continue to take part in these chat rooms and be part of these conversations, that somebody is monitoring them on a computer who pretends to be a member and finds out who they are and exposes them and their name and where they work. Let them fear that. Now, as I said in the piece, I hope, and I didn't just say this to sound nice or to protect myself. I said it because I meant it. I don't want anyone who's doxxed to have somebody go to their house and try to hurt them. I don't want them to go and mess with them at all. I think that going to someone's house and yelling at them, banging on the door, threatening them, even when they're a Nazi, that's just wrong. There's no room for that. And there's no way to control that tactic. I don't want to encourage it because I don't want it to happen to me and anyone else. And I wouldn't want it to happen to anyone's family. If this Nazi who's planning to kill people has kids, those kids aren't implicated in that Nazi's actions. If they are a kid living with their parents, the parents may or may not have anything to do with it. I don't want anybody to live in fear of being harmed. But I think the thought that those people might have their job, that their name exposed and where they work exposed, and they might lose their job, they might lose friends, they might have family turn on them. I don't mind that at all. I don't mind that at all. And so even though I prefer that we live in a world where you can't even find out where people live, I would prefer that. I'd prefer to put that genie back in the bottle. Yeah. Well, we're way beyond that now. And you can find out where people live relatively easily. I've hidden where I am pretty well at this particular point. We also hid the last place and eventually it was found. So it happens. And I'm just saying, if I have to worry about that, if my kids had to worry about that before they were out of the house, then I don't have any problem with fascists and terrorists worrying about it as well. And I think we got to be a lot less precious in a moment like this when we know that federal law enforcement just is not going to carry the load.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to change your mind and the tactics given the circumstances and the situation. And so when you have less protection, you have to find new ways to be able to protect yourself and others, certainly those who are more vulnerable, as well as those who are constantly speaking out like you, like me and others. But in this case, Yeah, you make a lot of good points for why.
I mean, the problem is, and as I say in the piece, I know the response is, yeah, but Tim, if we do that, they'll just dox us. But the thing is, they're going to do it anyway.
Like, they're going to do it anyway. Right. Yeah.
They're going to dox anybody that speaks out if it draws attention. If you just speak out and you've got 13 Twitter followers, they probably won't. Right. But if you say it in any way
if you're effective in any way,
if you say it in any way that might make a difference or that might gain any public attention, which if we're going to stop fascism, we need people to say it that loudly. We need, if you're going to say it at that level, they're going to dox. So the question is, what do we do? Do we sit and cower and go, oh, well, they might come after us, so I just won't say anything? That's not the way. Well,
there is no doubt about the fact that in recent history, much less most of American history, the federal government has not gone after white supremacist, right-wing, ultranationalist types. However, the FBI has in our lifetime often gone after the most extreme ones, from Ruby Ridge to those fake cowboy fucking guys occupying public land. What is their last name?
Bundys,
the Bundy boys, to David Koresh. I don't know where you qualify him, but when Democrats have been in charge during the Obama administration, Department of Homeland Security tried to identify right-wing terrorists, and there's sadly a correlation with veterans, and they had to put that document away. They had to be like, oh, I'm sorry. The DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano had to, but the Department of Justice under Obama and under Biden has in fact targeted and gone after and put in jail many of those on the right who have. But that's
ideally, I share some of the concerns of other, and I've had fellow leftists who've complained to me when I've defended the FBI doing this work against the far right, because they always point out that the FBI historically has far more infiltration of the left, and that's absolutely true. And it's not even untrue when Democrats are in power like that. That's what they were doing under the Kennedy administration, and that's what they were doing under Johnson, and that's what they were doing. They were also infiltrating black-led liberation organizations during the Obama years that were not terrorists. So they weren't only looking at right-wingers. I realize the potential of abuse is great. I realize the potential of abuse with the Palestinian liberation struggle would be at a peak right now. I know the way it can be abused. I would prefer, if it were possible, I would certainly prefer that the government not be in the business of doing this kind of thing. But the problem is, if the only people who are doing it are the private folks, right now, that's all we're going to have. But if that's all that's ever doing it, I'm glad that Antifa researchers are doing that research and exposure. But let's be honest. Let's say they stumble upon a terror cell. Well, Food Not Bombs can't go make an arrest.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Like
Exactly.
Your local anarchist bookstore, your Emma Goldman book club can't go stop them. They can expose them, but they can't stop them. So at some point, you've got to involve the state.
Yes.
Whether it's you do the research and then you hand it over to the state, or whether the state's involved from the beginning. So I realize the potential for abuse. I absolutely do. But I am more concerned about this sort of hands-off approach that says, let's not have law enforcement do any investigation of these people at all because we don't want to, because J. Edgar Hoover, because COINTELPRO. Yes, that was real and that was awful. But to the extent that these folks are threatening mass terrorism against marginalized populations in the name of destroying multiracial democracy and mass murder, I don't think we have the luxury of sitting here and thinking about, well, yeah, they killed Fred Hampton. I know they killed Fred Hampton, and they shouldn't have killed Fred Hampton with the help of the Chicago police and feeding them information. But that's not a reason not to stop Nazis today.
Right.
It's when Mar-a-Lago was raided, I remember hearing this from people on the left, this is just like J. Edgar Hoover. And they were comparing Donald Trump. They were literal leftists on Twitter comparing Donald Trump to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. I'm like, at what point where do you find the drugs that allow you to be that high to make that kind of
it's just lazy. It's lazy lack of understanding of how circumstances change and how you explain it well. Yeah. All good points. Really good stuff. Great talking to you. As always, it's always an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with you, Tim Wise. I'm looking forward to talking to you a lot more in 2025 and more of all things Tim Wise. So really appreciate you. Very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
All right, there he goes. Tim Wise. How about it? Go read him at Medium. Go follow him. Go support him. Let him know that you heard him here. He'll join us in Vegas. I hope you will as well. Go get your tickets now if you haven't already. Have a great and safe New Year's Eve. I will talk to you tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love you. Jon Carroll taking us out as he always does. JonCarroll.org right now, everybody.
Let the brave meet the challenge, let the meek flee. Oh, you better stand up, stand up. When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up on your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to